Thank you so much. Welcome to High Stakes at Home, Sport and Gambling's Hidden Toll. So today we're going to look at the intersection of sport and gambling and domestic violence, and importantly try and look to see what's next in Australia. If you're a footy fan, you would know that the men's season, the NRL and the AFL, has just wrapped up, and if you went to a game across winter, you would have seen betting advertising everywhere. If you open your phone, if you watch TV, you would see it. I was looking the other day literally just at what time a game is, and you see the teams, the location, the time, and then the odds. So it really is everywhere. It feels like one of those crucial elements that you see with every bit of sport right now. So what does that have to do with gendered violence and what's happening in Canberra to maybe curb some of that or look at those issues? We'll go into that. My name is Declan Byrne. I'm a broadcaster at ABC, and I'll moderate today. And thanks for coming. We'll get to you guys a bit later. So if you do have some burning questions, make sure you keep across them. I'll introduce our panel. First up to my left is a Walkey Award-winning journalist, Jess Hill. She's one of Australia's most respected thinkers on gendered violence. She's a professor at UTS and advocate, and recently wrote a quarterly essay on violence against women and children, what's working, what's not, and what's next. So Jess is here. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
And next to Jess is, let's give Jess a clap. And next to Jess is a man who has transitioned from the scrum to the Senate, David Pocock. Thank you for joining us. The first ever independent senator for the ACT, elected in 2022 and then again this year. If you know David's work, he's very passionate and outspoken about the environment, equality, integrity, and as we've seen in the last week or so, accountability and transparency. So thank you for joining us, Senator David Pocock. I guess we should start by talking about this intersection. So maybe, Jess, you can tell us about how gambling, sport, and domestic violence are all linked.
Yeah, sure. And I think, thank you to David for coming up all the way from Canberra, to be here today. And thank you to Declan, who came in very last minute. I thought I'd just set the scene a bit too, because actually I was thinking earlier this morning, I don't think I've ever seen an event that talks about gambling and domestic violence in one breath, and certainly not the role that sports has to play in that. So this is definitely, I think, a national first. So thank you for being here. So what is the link? And I'd say I would also bring in alcohol, because you really can't talk about the impact of gambling without the impact of alcohol, particularly when you're talking about sports. But let's talk about gambling. What is the link between gambling and family violence? If you have problem gambling, if you're a problem gambler, you're 3 times more likely to use family violence. It's also, if you think about where family violence comes from and what we've come to understand as coercive control, really underpinning that, where, perpetrators will use various tactics: isolation, degradation, threats, setting rules, financial abuse, that is really the heart of domestic violence. Now, if you bring in gambling to a scenario like that, you have shame, secrecy, often the illicit use of funds or siphoning off of money. And when you have shame and secrecy in a family unit, that's a terrible dynamic on its own. But when you have someone who's maybe more susceptible to needing to exert control and who feels entitled to use aggression, violence, and other tactics to get that control in a household, and they've got a gambling problem, and they're seeing in the sports codes they love, they're seeing gambling just absolutely intricately interconnected with those sporting codes. They're getting inducements, emails, phone calls to put more money in the gambling accounts, and then they feel entitled to just, use the family money to spend more and more on gambling. That becomes a really potent, volatile dynamic in the household. There's some incredible anecdotal stories about what that actually looks like. One recent research report, and there's not a lot, but one said there was a woman who she confronted her partner about stealing money to use on gambling. He got so angry, he locked her and the kids in the bathroom, terrorised them, and then killed the pets. Another man said to his wife, "Look, I need you to control help me control my addiction. So I need you to keep the key to the safe. Do not let me access the safe. So she did what he asked. And then when he was in that sort of build-up phase of needing to gamble, he took a sledgehammer to the safe in front of her and the kids. There's so many, and the ways in which perpetrators will then blame their partners for their losses, and if they're going, that sense of anger and frustration when you lose big is so intense, and the first person you're probably going to take that out on, particularly if you've already got that dynamic at play, is going to be your partner and probably also your children. And the other thing I think just around alcohol, because when you're talking about grand finals, we have at AFL grand finals, Victoria Police say there's a 20% rise in family violence incidents that are reported. At NRL, it's a 40% rise. And when you're talking about that, you've got gambling and alcohol in this really volatile mix. It's pushed out the entire time, also advertised with these norms that actually we're trying to undo in Australia, masculine norms around aggression and control and dominance, and that, if you're a real man, you're going to be drinking while you watch the footy and you're going to be having a punt, and anyone else is sort of less than. So I think that overall the intersection between sports and gambling and alcohol and domestic and family violence is really insidious and often unspoken. The last thing I'll say about the alcohol's role, because we don't talk a lot about that connection, is that alcohol is a whole of brain drug and it's a threat multiplier. So if you're, say for example, if there's already tension or if there's already coercive control and domestic violence happening in the home, the presence of alcohol accelerates. It's like jet fuel into that environment. And it also means that the ability for the perpetrator to realise what they're doing and maybe pull back at a critical moment is really hindered. They get very fixated on perceived disrespect, and any perceived constraints on their personal power is incredibly offensive, when someone's drunk. When you're drunk, like, you get really fixated, like, oh, I dropped a $50 note in the gutter, someone help me look for it. You can't stop looking for it. It's like that, but in a relationship, like, I know you're having an affair, I know what you wrote on that guy's Facebook post, and they'll just keep hammering and hammering and hammering because they get totally fixated. So if you've got sports really promoting these products, you've basically got them normalising a culture that endorses two prime risk factors for family violence.
You talk about normalising a culture. David, from your perspective, you were in sport for decades as an athlete. When you left sport, were you suddenly eyes open to the betting culture that comes across with it? Or when you were playing, were you pretty aware of the growth of it across your playing time?
No, you're aware of it. It's hard to avoid. I played rugby union, and I think of the three contact football codes, it's by far the least exposed to betting or gambling advertising in terms of sponsors, but then also in terms of the business model. Like, they haven't entered into these sorts of agreements with betting companies where they're getting kickbacks on bets placed. So it wasn't as pervasive, but yes, there were the signs around the ground at most grounds that you play at. As a player, I guess you've got to sort of weigh up, like, what are the things that I'm uncomfortable about, and how do I advocate internally? What's my role or responsibility to talk about things publicly? But I think what I've observed over the sort of last, 10 years is just how much more advertising there is. And a lot of people will refer to the Murphy report, a parliamentary inquiry that was done 2 years ago by the late Peter Murphy. And I really think, like, this is a landmark piece of work that is Parliament at its best. Even if you just read the foreword that Peter wrote as the committee chair, like, this is something that I really think shows the kind of political courage, leadership, foresight we need. That was combined with evidence-based policy, and sort of sets out, this is how bad it is. This is what is happening to sport. We are at a juncture where we risk sport actually being, don't know, denigrated. Like it becomes this thing that is just a vessel for gambling, not actually what sport can and should be in communities across the country. I think that committee kind of laid out the problems with the nexus between gambling and sport and the need to break that and break it urgently and get on with that. And you kind of line that up with the tragic response from the Albanese government on gambling, and it's very hard to watch in Parliament, and to sit with people who are struggling with addiction. And I think, for men, shame that comes up from everyone you speak to, just the shame that men feel, not being able to deal with this thing that they hate, and seeing the impact on their lives and the people that they love around them. So it was there, but I don't think it was there to the extent that we're now seeing, and certainly not when you look at AFL, NRL.
We'll talk a bit more about that Murphy report soon, because I think it's a big part of it. Quickly on changing law, and again, it's great to get your insight in a little bit, but Jess, you had in your essay the idea that to change law, the government needs evidence and social license. David's talked about this report that's 2 years old. We haven't seen any of the recommendations, I don't think, taken up. What's missing at the moment in that evidence and social license conversation for change to happen in this area?
Funnily enough, this is the one area where that is like the evidence and the social license is already present. What they need is to not be so scared by the threats that are being made by sporting codes, by media operators, that if you phase out gambling advertising, that free to air will collapse, that the AFL will no longer be able to offer Auskick to all the kiddies. There's not only those threats that the sky is going to fall in if we phase out gambling advertising, because essentially that's like propping up our economy, but that also, the amount of status that is afforded to being close with those codes and with the people running them is a really key part of this. As David's seen just this week and throughout his time in Canberra, that the access that the heads of codes, of sporting codes, have to Parliament and to politicians is quite like constant. It's not like, we need to make a meeting. It's like, come to the corporate box of this final. There's this like sense of you get included into something that is like quintessentially Australian. It's the quintessential part of Australian culture. A lot of these politicians are fans, so there's personal perks that come from doing what the codes want you to do. But there's also fear, and very real fear. We see this in states and territories as well when they try to regulate pokies, that if you take a stand and you do something like phase out gambling, you're going to be subject to a campaign from very powerful and well-funded interests to end your political career. And we've seen that again and again in various different issues. So the social license is there, the most strongest I think it's ever been. It's about the percentage of the population that wants to see gambling advertising phased out is in the majority, upwards of 75%. It's at the same level as it was when tobacco advertising was phased out. And interestingly, Whitlam was the first to make the call to phase it out on free-to-air television. And where did the tobacco companies go after that? They went to sports. And, they had the Benson and Hedges test and the Winfield Cup. And the same threats were made at that time, which is, you take tobacco advertising out, the clubs are going to collapse. Did they collapse? No. They probably went to gambling companies for to reform their revenue streams. But, there's always going to be threats. The alcohol companies, they campaigned for 20 years just against having a label saying that using alcohol while pregnant could harm your unborn baby. They campaigned for 20 years. And the reason why they do that is not because that's necessarily going to affect sales. It's to say to politicians, if you see how hard we're going to go on this, imagine how hard we'd go if you really tried to regulate us and what we could do to you and your career.
So for people who don't know this Murphy inquiry, the late Labor MP Peter Murphy, it feels like her legacy was attached to this. You've said we haven't seen anything for 2 years. Take us to Canberra. For people who've never been there, who don't know what goes on, how can nothing happen across the 2 years when one of their closest friends and co-workers shows us the evidence of that connection between sport and gambling?
It's a really good question, and I think it's one of the things that is really hard to stomach in Parliament, is seeing the evidence, the work done, as you said, like someone's legacy there, who they all say that they love and respect, and 2 years later, nothing. And when the government is asked about, well, what about the Murphy report, what are you doing? You know, the Prime Minister will just regurgitate this like list of things that we've done. We've done more than any government since Federation. We've done BetStop. We've done this. We've done that. That stuff was actually from a coalition report in 2018 and work that they'd started that Labor then completed or implemented that really doesn't have a lot to do with the Murphy report. And it's a real distraction from the bigger issue, which is that Peter V'landys has so much influence over the Prime Minister. There have been, I think, at least 2 instances now where the Prime Minister has been asked about gambling reform and has got up and has given some statistic that no one's ever heard of. And my office will go to experts and ask them, like, where does this stat come from? Have you heard it before? I'll ask the Prime Minister's office at estimates, was this in talking points? Where does this stat come from? No idea. The only other person to say that thing publicly was Peter V'landys. So we're getting this influence of someone like that over the Prime Minister, where I think if you put this to a conscience vote in Parliament, if you didn't have to obey your party line, I honestly think that 80-90% of MPs and senators would vote for basically the whole Murphy report. You know, at the time it was unanimous. And so this really is vested interests. And this is a government that doesn't have the courage to actually stare down the sports, the gambling companies, and TV, and say, we're doing this. We're going to figure out a way to ensure that there is still free to air television. That's really important. But you can't tell me that that's too hard to do. We could be doing that, and you know, one of the recommendations in the Murphy report was to actually put a levy on gambling companies. You know, we're losing 30 billion a year as Australians, placing, I think, you know, I don't know what the actual figure is. I think a couple $100 billion in bets, maybe. And so if you put a small levy on that, like there is your funding to actually transition all sorts of things, actually pay for some of the damage. You know, some of the other recommendations are honestly, the foresight in this report when you read it 2 years later, like the number one recommendation is that we as a committee, as a parliament, recommend that the government have one minister in charge of this reform. Last week in Senate estimates, he's sitting there saying, hey, wanting to talk about the Murphy report, you know, what's happening? Oh, that's the other department, you know, you need to go ask them questions. And so it is tragic, and honestly, it's a national disgrace that we have the evidence, the majority of Australians wanting action, and a parliament that sat on its hands, a government that sat on its hands, and the parliament's been advocating for it for the last 2 years.
So let's get into lobbying then and influence. Jess, from your perspective, I can't wait to hear David's on who's coming to him, what those conversations are like, but from your perspective, how hard is it to get time with these people who can affect change?
Depends on who you are. You know, I think the point is that there's, as David experienced, you know, with the Parliamentary Sports Club, is time is relative. It's, you know, it's like the proverbial golf course meeting, right? And it's like you play sports with the CEO of Responsible Wagering Australia, who's, you know, peak body representing gambling companies. Like that's access. So there's meetings and there's access. And yes, David obviously has a real bird's eye view over this. But yeah, I think that it's not so much that people are getting meetings. Often when you have a meeting with someone, it's quite high level. You don't have a lot of time. It's really about relationships. And that's, you know, as David was saying, that influence that someone like Peter V'landys, someone like Andrew Dillon, you know, head of the AFL, has over the Prime Minister particularly is is really at the heart of this issue, because it's really clear gambling advertising will be banned, and I think the gambling companies know that best of all. And I think that's probably why we're seeing this absolute flooding of the zone, where just the level of gambling advertising in every platform, but particularly free to air, is so intense. It's like they know they have to set this social norm for this generation, because eventually they will be like tobacco, and that's inevitable. But it's like, how many more of this generation are we going to feed to the charnel house of gambling before we make this inevitable call that it needs to be banned?
So take us down the highway to Canberra. You came into politics from a very different area. I imagine, for want of a better term, you would have a good bullshit radar. What's it like when people come to you, they want your time, and are lobbying for a certain point of view?
I think this is one of the problems in our politics and media, is that nuanced debates are very hard to have, or nuanced opinions even in an online article. I actually think lobbyists are really important. They play a really important role when it comes to issues and legislation, because you're able to hear from groups of Australians that are affected. Lobbyists include community groups, patient groups who are affected by a certain disease or rare cancer or whatever it might be. And it's really important to be hearing from that specific group about their issues, from someone who's actually sat down and looked at the legislation and said, hey, this is how it's affecting us, or coming and saying, hey, this certain setup isn't working, this is what we need. And so I think lobbying is a good thing in Parliament House. I have real concerns about the lack of transparency. We are just absolute laggards when it comes to our lobbying regime and how we set the rules. So in Australia, you have the lobbyist register, where if you are a third-party lobbyist, so if you work for a lobbying firm, you're registered and you have to list your clients. And if I meet with Jess, I have to actually disclose what we're meeting about, who my clients are, that sort of thing. But the definition of a lobbyist is so narrow that it only accounts for about 20% of lobbyists in the country. So during each parliament, there's between 1,500 and 2,000 people who have what they call sponsored passes, who are representing companies, other organisations, Responsible Wagering Australia, and they're not lobbyists. They simply go to a politician, ask for a sponsored pass and get one. There's a brief security check and away they go. They literally have an access all areas pass to Parliament House. We have no idea who they are, who gave them that pass, and what they're in Parliament lobbying for. And I think that is a very real problem. As to specifically with gambling, I think that there are some very valid concerns around free-to-air television and the current business model, and what that'll mean, taking advertising away. But you cannot tell me that we can't find a solution. You cannot tell me that we should not do anything and enable sport to continue just to be used to flog a harmful product to young people. And I think that's one of the things that I think we should really be framing this debate around, is looking at young people. Like, the research is showing that the amount of gambling ads young people are seeing, that 75% of young people think that gambling is just a normal part of enjoying sport. 3 out of 4 young people. There are now more young people under 18 who have online betting accounts than young people who play a bunch of sports, basketball, a whole bunch of sports. Like, I think there's almost 750,000 under 18s who are gambling. So this is a huge problem. Politicians know it, but I think the reason why we're not seeing action truly is not because of the lobbying of TV and sport. It is because of these relationships where the Prime Minister, for some reason, is listening to people that I don't know why, like he has a relationship with and doesn't want to. It's ridiculous.
But it's also that revolving door, isn't it? Like, you have the advisors to these ministers who leave their advisory positions and go straight into the industries that relate to their former role. And so I mean, not to name names, but recently meeting with some politicians around bringing in alcohol regulations that would actually prioritise the prevention of family and domestic violence. And, you know, one of the first groups that they go to when they're writing this bill is the industry. And it's not that they're just seeking, it's like, sure, seek information from the industry about what impacts would such a bill have on your business, but it's that they're seeking approval. You know, and they'll say to you, like, well, we tried to get this through, but they really won't cop it. And it's like, so you're the actual minister. They don't run you, but then the advisor, who's, you know, sometimes quite powerful in that office, is eyeballing a job with those same companies. So a lot of that sort of, it's not just do you get a meeting, it's that these people are looking at careers and how they can monetize their current position in politics later in the private sector.
So let's rewind a week then to this Parliamentary Sports Club. First of all, Jess, did you know anything about the Parliamentary Sports Club a week before?
Not really, except I knew that David played in it because I was like, wow, you'd be pretty keen to have him on your team.
Yeah. What was going through your head last week? Take us to the week, the fallout, the blowback of, what happened?
It was all pretty bizarre. So there's this Parliamentary Sports Club, which in my mind facilitated parliamentary sport. So you can play, most mornings there's sport going. So tennis, netball, basketball, soccer, touch footy. They play a few cricket games, but not very often. And, you know, you literally turn up, there's some balls and some cones, and away you go. And it's a great way to get to know parliamentarians. You know, it's pretty brutal environment in there at times, and so this is a way you can start the day, do some exercise, and actually get to know people that otherwise you may not spend much time with in there. And so I think it's a really important part of Parliament. The thing that I hadn't realised was that there were actually corporates who pay for access to this club, and you know, maybe some of that's on me. Apparently it was in the newsletter, which I didn't read.
You don't read every newsletter?
I was meant to have read their newsletter that they send out. But I assume people just turned up and played. But it turns out, as a corporate, you pay, and then that actually allows you to come and play sport with parliamentarians, which I actually have no issue with, you know, the odd lobbyist coming down and playing touch footy. I take exception when they're paying to be there, because it's gross, and it speaks to all the things that we're talking about, where it is that soft power, it is that time spent. They may not be directly lobbying you, but they're building the relationship. So when you do see them, it's like, oh, hey, you know, we play touch footy on a Tuesday morning. This all really came out because, I don't know, a couple of months ago, there was a local mental health charity in the ACT called Running for Resilience, doing great work, really creating, you know, run clubs, walk clubs where people can come together, and then they'll go and, you know, have a beer or have a coffee afterwards. And they came to Parliament, did an event, kind of talked about what they were doing. And Responsible Wagering Australia, the peak body group for the 6 big betting companies, put on LinkedIn. So great to be at this event, and kind of made out that like they were either part of it or almost sort of helping sponsor it. And this was brought to me and my team's attention. Contacted Running for Resilience. They were filthy. You know, gambling is a big part of mental health issues and suicide. The Journo did some more digging and actually found out that the Parliamentary Sports Club has been a registered lobbying organisation for many years now, but under a different name, under a Sports Hydrant, which no one picked up. But they've recently changed their name, and so it came up as Parliamentary Sports Club, the name change. So this raised even more questions, because one of their clients was Responsible Wagering Australia. And so anyway, I called the CEO of the sports club up, and I raised my concerns. Their view is that they don't really pick and choose. He said, well, you should have read the newsletter. I said, well, I haven't read the newsletter. And this was not made clear to me that I was joining a lobbying organisation. And then he said, well, we registered as a lobbying organisation under advice that it would be the right thing to do to exercise sort of caution. But I've actually I'm waiting for new advice, and I think I can deregister. And I said, well, that's even more problematic because you're taking money, providing access, and you're not a lobbying organisation. Like, this highlights a bigger issue. And so then I asked some questions at Estimates because the Prime Minister is the honorary president of the sports club, which is a registered lobbying organisation. And so what does it mean to live in a country where your PM is the president of a registered lobbying organisation, which they were at the time I was asking those questions? And I was trying to find out, like, is this something Prime Minister and Cabinet have looked at? Should they be? Senator Wong sort of took exception to my questioning, hated it, and I thought it was a very valid question. Anyway, in the wake of that, got a text message saying, "I'm not welcome at the club, not welcome at sport."
They've kicked out their best member in terms of footy.
And I mean, the irony of it all was I actually wasn't a member this term because I haven't paid my dues because of these concerns that we were busy trying to dig into and look into. But a bizarre turn of events, and I think the most problematic thing for me, and the thing I think it highlights, is just how normal a lot of people thought this was, like, including Minister Wong. Like, what are you on about? Like, you're just trying to get a headline here. Like, what is wrong with Responsible Wagering Australia sponsoring the Parliamentary Sports Club and turning up and playing sport? Like, that's just how this place works.
Why do you need so many sponsors?
I don't know. This is this is, I think, a question that a lot of parliamentarians are asking is, like, where does this money actually go? Yeah, they have the odd function, but it's a weird setup. Yeah.
What's the fallout been the last 48 hours or so?
Well, I think it was a massive own goal from them, to use a sporting analogy. It's blown up, and I think it's put sort of gambling reform back in the news. Like, we're starting to see, like, well, why can't we break this nexus between gambling, advertising, and sport? Of course we can't break it. If at Parliament House, this is baked into the way that this place works, and it's just considered normal. And so I think, we're going to need more and more people saying to their local MP, like, I don't care how nice you are, if you're not actually going to start putting the community ahead of vested interests, like, I'm going to go find someone else to vote for. Because, I think at the end of the day, that seems to be the only language or threat that politicians understand from Joe Public, from all of us in the community.
Let's chat about laws now. So that influence that may or may not be happening into laws, and tie it back from gambling to gendered violence, Jess. David's talked about just how many under 18-year-olds have a sports betting account. How do you think you can link that stat to laws to then hopefully prevention of gendered violence?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you're basically grooming a new generation to use gambling as a way of being involved in the sports that they love, and as you were mentioning before when we were sitting down, is that, like, when you open up the website to see, like, when's the sporting event on, see the time it's on, see the players, and then you see the odds down below. Like, it's so, like, interconnected. There's like, we've scrambled this egg. How do we unscramble it? And that's how it must feel for young people, that you don't know any different. It's like, well, the way that the odds are, you actually get a better sense of who's the best player, or who's more likely, because the market would never be wrong. But I think that in terms of laws and certainly the impact on young people always seems to motivate more strongly than impact on adults. By the time you're an adult, you're sort of out to pasture, and it's like the damage has been done. So it's certainly something to leverage. I sat on a panel, 6-person panel, that did a rapid review into prevention approaches to violence. And what we identified, and has actually recently been identified globally, is that one of the most underutilised methods of prevention is regulation. And if you look at, say, for example, the heavy use of alcohol, the World Health Organization says if you want to reduce the heavy use of alcohol, you reduce availability, so you reduce the number of liquor outlets in a certain area, you reduce the level of marketing It's one of the top 4 ways to reduce heavy use of alcohol. And we've got, I think, to a point now in Australia, alcohol, gambling, it's like part of our national culture. It can feel almost like if you take that away, who are we? Like, where would the larrikin go if he wasn't able to have a flutter? If he wasn't able to have a punt, if he wasn't able to have a beer, and for a long time, and this is all very, I used to work in advertising for a short period of time. They all know this. They know how to leverage this and how to make their products seem like a, unavoidable part of our culture, and that's what they're doing. I think in terms of the laws, like, it's all there, as David's saying in the Murphy report. They've sketched out how to do this responsibly in such a way that wouldn't have the impacts that everyone's talking about. Australia is, I would say, unique around the world. Every time you want to actually do something that would bring in a major change, there's a lot of henny penny skies falling in responses. Other countries don't operate in that same way. I think it's maybe because we're so comfortable. We think, like, why would you mess with this? Everything's so good, and the stuff that's not good, most of us just don't see. It's under the surface. But once you get to a point, as you say, that social license, once you get to that point where the majority of the community is just disgusted and outraged by this, there is eventually a tipping point. And that's what we saw with tobacco, is it just got, and I think gambling, it's difficult with alcohol. There is a pro-social element. You're not going to get rid of alcohol altogether, and nobody wants to. But what's the positive element of gambling? Like, I just think it's going to become a pariah product the same way as tobacco is, and it's really a lot of politicians and public servants just being like, I don't want to be the one that does that. Just let someone else do that.
And I think one of the really worrying things talking to researchers is if you look at the way that it's being advertised to young people, and when they talk to particularly young men, boys, they love the ads. They're funny. They've got Shaquille O'Neal and their favourite influencers doing funny stuff, and it's about mateship and having a laugh and doing all these things. And they're actually finding, like, by the time young Australians are finishing school, they have brand loyalty. Like, this is my company. And that is a huge problem when you have a generation of young people thinking, one, it's normal. Two, it's these companies are great. They speak to me through my favourite sports, influencers, etc. And three, this is the company I'm gonna give my money to. And so that's where regulation comes in, and it is all laid out there in the Murphy report.
And I think just the last thing on that is also, a lot of people don't know what our national strategy is to end violence against women and kids. But at the heart of it is that we are supposed to be changing the way Australians think about gender and power, and upending old rigid gender norms and harmful modes of masculinity. And so that is the national strategy that every state and territory and the federal government have signed up to. They've also signed up to end gendered violence within a single generation. So I like to sort of pitch that as like net zero violence by 2050. And so to have the alcohol and gambling industries advertising using all of those outdated and rigid forms of masculinity as a way of appealing to young men, it is literally doing the opposite of what the national strategy is working towards. So you have sporting codes who are funded by government to do violence prevention campaigns. They'll go into schools, they'll talk about respecting women, they'll go into schools and talk about, how you don't have to, accept all these outmoded forms of masculinity like aggression and dominance, the need to be in control. And then on the grand final or any sporting event, they will host advertising that says the exact opposite. So government funding is going to these codes, and basically whatever they're able to say by taking a minute's silence, as they did in April 2024 when there was that horrific spike in domestic homicides. Andrew Dillon from the AFL saying the only acceptable rate of violence against women in this country is 0. How can you square that with the fact that you're promoting the very products that are risk factors for family violence and promoting the very culture that the prevention campaigns are supposed to be undoing? I just feel like that is like the fact that there's not more people speaking about this also talks to the fact that I think sports has, to a certain degree, captured some of the violence prevention agencies, because it shouldn't be that this is the first time we've talked about this. Sports has been talked about as a setting for preventing violence for decades because it's seen as one of the most powerful ways to influence social norms. So why aren't we talking about advertising? Advertisers know that they set social norms through advertising, so why aren't violence prevention agencies backing these calls from the Murphy Report, from anti-gambling advocates, from from alcohol regulation campaigners to say we need to regulate? It's not just about individual responsibility, it's about regulation. That is how we're going to prevent violence in Australia.
We'll get to some questions in a second, but briefly looking in from the outside, how close do you think that tipping point is where money, influence, power is outweighed by public outcry?
Well, events like this help. And, the fact that David's made the effort today to come up from Canberra to do this, it's actually, and, we had Four Corners last week do this. But the thing is to not let this go quiet. These things come up, over the last, 20 plus years. We have politicians like Andrew Wilkie, we had Julie Gillard try to do it. We've had people who have really put themselves on the line to try to move the dial on this, but it often just goes right back underground. So I guess the point is that we just have to keep pushing, but really the turning point can just be that there's another leader in charge, or that one state or territory really makes the move and sets and puts the other states and territories to shame. It's hard to know. You need that social license, but the moment that it's going to tip into action is actually hard to pinpoint because it's actually very based on the personalities in power.
Are there any questions out there? You can chuck your hand up if you've got one. Yep, on the left. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really interested in the scale of the cultural change needed, and I'd be curious to hear, particularly Senator Pocock, your thoughts after being a public figure in sporting culture at the heart of this scene. It's really difficult to mobilise the scale of cultural change required to kind of disentangle sport and gambling and alcohol in the way that we're talking about here. What need is this meeting in men? Like from being in the thick of it, what deep need is this filling for people, and how can we help to move people into kind of healthier ways to express that?
Oh, that is that's a cracking question. We know cultural change is hard. I think there's, like so many of these really big problems we face, we both need Parliament to actually do their job when it comes to regulating things like ads and putting a duty of care on these companies and ensuring that their products are safer, and they have also, a lot more safeguards in place to deal with people who are problem gamblers. I think then more broadly, how does cultural change happen? I don't know. I assume slowly and then fast. At some point, you hit tipping points, and I'd say we're probably at the slowly phase on this. I think as men, maybe to take it back to sort of family and domestic violence, one of the things I've heard in Parliament is people talk about, I guess not directly, but when they talk about it in speeches, like this is framed as a women's issue, like this is a men's issue. Men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of the violence. Men are doing most of the killing of women. And we've got to be able to talk about that. And at the same time, we've got to be able to talk about the fact that if you're under 45 as a man in Australia, the most dangerous person to you is yourself. So like this whole system is clearly not working for women who are being murdered by their intimate partner, but it's not working for men either. And so I think there is a lot of work to do to actually be able to hold those two things and say, yes, we've got to tell men that they have to do better. You've got to stop killing women, but we've actually got to start to your question, dealing with why is it that we have a culture where so many men are so cut off from their feeling side of them that they can't emotionally regulate, they don't have the tools to be able to actually function as a human being and deal with these emotions. I don't know, there's a huge amount there, and again, like I think it's easy to for people to kind of get entrenched in their position and just blame men for this thing, but like patriarchy isn't working for men either. If you look at the stats, if you look at men being lonely, committing suicide, all those things, we have to find a way to talk about this and actually talk about, well, what is positive masculinity? We all know what toxic masculinity is now. What does it actually mean to be a man in 2025? And I think that's a much harder and probably messier conversation, but I think my sense is that there are more and more men wanting to have that.
Can I just speak to that briefly? I think you only need to look to the ads. The advertisers know what guys are looking for from gambling. It's the feeling of risk-taking, the feeling of winning, of having the edge of other people, especially over other men. Because, the sort of rule of patriarchy is, some men's power over other men and all men's power over women. But definitely that competition with other guys, like, I'm going to have the edge over you. And you see that, like, it's more lighthearted joshing in some of those, ads, but it's often, ripping off your mates for losing or, all that sort of thing. So it's in the advertising. And then, just like, if anyone's seen The Century of the Self, see Edward Bernays in the early 20th century, a PR, Machiavellian PR expert who managed to make smoking represent freedom for women, and managed to groom a whole generation of female smokers. What you don't realise when you go into this with this idea, as of the branding idea of what it's going to give you, is that the addictive nature of the product is going to have you behaving in ways that you can't control. It's not about, this whole gamble responsibly, which the government has adopted in its campaigns, is just a complete fail, and it's just what the industry wants is to bring it back to individual responsibility and not look at the way that these products actually induce addiction. And compulsion. And when it comes to changing culture, you can change culture overnight with regulation. So one example I think is really pertinent to this is drink driving. You can have billboards up forever saying you shouldn't drink drive because, probably, there's a good chance you might kill someone or yourself. They're not very persuasive. Even when there was clear information that tobacco was going to kill you or the people you were smoking around, people were like, maybe other people, and it's always another person that's going to happen to, not you. But the day that they brought in random breath test units, and it's like, well, now if you drink and drive, a police officer might pull you over and you'll lose your licence. The road accidents dropped dramatically within 3 weeks. Because what people don't like is being punished. And having their license taken away. They also don't like being fined for smoking indoors. And pubs don't like being fined for having someone smoking indoors. So then they regulate that behaviour. Regulation, saying to Declan before, sometimes it feels like Four Corners is the only active regulator in Australia. But regulation works. It really does. And the whole idea that I've been railing against too with violence prevention, that we can change attitudes through awareness campaigns or through advertising or through, just speaking to kids, it's like we can change it through regulation, but it's harder because you have to say no to people that you want to say yes to.
And one of the interesting things, talking to a couple of people about the RBT thing, is that there were focus groups who'd been talking to people about their attitudes to drink driving, who thought it was okay as long as you hadn't had too many and you're a good driver and these sorts of things. Those same people, after there were random breath testing, now thought that you were an idiot if you drink and drive. And so that does not only have consequences, but it changes the way people think about it.
Completely. Like, Australians are actually quite obedient people. Like, I lived for quite a while in Beirut, and it's like, put a random breath test unit, probably someone would just like attack it, for starters, just be so offended that would even be there. Whereas when you bring in the regulations in Australia, we're like, oh, okay, sorry. Like, we're actually quite an obedient people, for better or worse.
Do we need a random gambling test where they pick someone and they send a letter to their family and friends of the person's actual gambling stats for embarrassment, and for that idea of doing it alone, you find no one knows about it, but if you tell everyone, actually, I'm down this amount.
Declan, you should pitch that.
Well, who's going to take it up? Are there any more questions? Yeah, there's a couple over here.
Like, so amazing. Thanks so much for this session. Definitely the best this week so far. I actually run a social sport community here in Sydney, and so what I wanted to know is just some ideas or an action plan from a grassroots up. Obviously, you guys are coming from the top down and, heading up government, talking about lobbyists, but what else can we be doing? So one of our principles is actually doing everything mixed gender, making sure that men and women and non-binary people all play together. And so I have lots of ideas around, having sessions potentially around wellbeing and all the things we've sort of talked about today. So yeah, just wanted some suggestions or what we could be doing as a community, grassroots, like the sport from the bottom up. Thank you.
All right. And that's fantastic. I think community sports organisations might be actually where some of the pressure comes from. I think, perhaps not, you might not need this advice, but probably is to refuse sponsorship and partnerships with alcohol and gambling is one, but also to raise your own voices. And, you saw I was reading through the submissions to the Murphy Review, and you see some from community sports and actually representing what is the local feeling around this. And that there's a lot of mythology around the, clubs New South Wales, around Australian Hotel Association, around it's like, we keep community sports alive. Well, what happens when community sports revolts and says, we don't want your money, and we don't want that money going into community sports at all? And so there's a political role there for you if you're interested, I think.
We can probably sneak in one more question since we started late. Feel free to leave if you have to run off, but we'll grab one more.
Hi there, not so much a question but a comment. First of all, full disclosure that I previously have been on my local rural club board, and the reason for that is I was a beneficiary of the sporting aspect of it, and in rural regions the clubs do, they're the place. There's no restaurants, there's no places to do sport. That's the heart and soul. My motivation for going on with the board was to try to get revenue from some other sport place besides gambling, because it is the heart of the community, but it's been taken over by evil sources of revenue. I didn't last particularly long on the board. And that is that there is a massive cultural thing from the top in all of these industry places. There's easy revenue from gambling, and as long as you're in the black rather than the red, they choose to ignore where it comes from as far as the social kind of consequences. The reason why I wanted to bring up the comment is there's been a lot of talk here as far as men and their problem gambling. Having spent that small time on the board, what was really, really, really distressing is the number one people who spent their money through the pokies were women, single, unemployed, over the age of 50, who were usually had a really, really, really sad time in their life. So it's bigger than just the men. It really is a problem for us women as well.
Can I just comment on that? Because that was an omission about the link between gambling and violence, is that there's, a high percentage of victim survivors who will go and gamble, particularly in pokies. I must say quite a few of the codes own poker machines and get quite a lot of money from those poker machines, but they'll go there because it's the only place that's open till 3 or 4 a.m. Nobody will bother you there. and they'll pour money into these machines, and then that acts as an accelerant for the violence. It acts as a justification for their partner using violence against them because they've spent all this money on the poker machines. They've gone there so that they can have space to breathe. And nobody will ask them any questions. Nobody will, aside from, do you want another drink? And nobody will inquire about their well-being. You could be sitting in there with a black eye, and it's sort of like the unspoken code is you just let that person do what they need to do, you know? So you're absolutely right. And it arguably, gambling plays as big a role in domestic violence when it's used to problematic levels by victim survivors as it does when it's used by perpetrators.
And maybe just a comment on the community sport funding side of things. I think this is nuts in this country, how little we actually fund community grassroots sports, and particularly sports outside of the big codes that have sort of that flow down of money in some way. At a time where we're seeing, increases in mental health issues, increases in loneliness, increases in childhood obesity, you'd think that as a country we would say, right, let's double down and actually invest more in community sport. At the same time that we're banning under 16s from social media, let's actually provide people with places to go. And I don't understand why we don't more. The thing that I get told as well, the budget is tight. And the thing I say is, well, we seem to be happy to give away a lot of our gas for free. And until you stop doing that and raise some revenue, I'm going to keep banging on about the things that I think we should be funding in Australia.
That's a whole nother session. Thanks so much for coming along, as Jess said at the start. Yeah. As Jess said, you've hardly had this conversation, especially on this scale. So thank you so much to South by Southwest Sydney. Thanks for coming along, and thanks to Senator David Pocock and Jess Hill for making it happen and, giving us all of their immense knowledge on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Declan. Thanks, everyone.